Most impact organizations know that something doesn't work anymore the way it used to be. Yet, they don't know what to do about it. And they don't know what kind of solution they need to explore. In this episode, we're going to explore what are the forces that are changing the way in which things have been working so far, and the reframe that organizations can use in order to stay relevant. My name is Federico Spiezia. This is In Evidence, the podcast for impact-first organizations. Whereas before, thought leadership was enough in order to be visible and being accounted for, nowadays that is not the case anymore. And there are three main forces that are shaping society, that are shaping the public debate, and those are forces that think tanks, knowledge organizations need to take account. Now, before I start to analyze what these forces are, very important to consider that I'm not saying that you need to acritically join the trend and become like the change that you're seeing into society, but it's important to acknowledge that because these are the shifts that your company, your organization is competing against. The very first force is that there has been a democratization of attention and communication, where being rigorous is not enough anymore. So what I'm saying by that is that whereas the society that we knew a few decennia ago was society where it was way more rigorous who was what and what was the credibility of each party, for example, of universities, journalists, we now live in a society where everyone has access to media, everyone can be a small media in itself. That has been the boom of podcasts. It has been the boom of blogs, articles, where the barriers and the boundaries between traditional and acknowledged media and the new ones is shifting. Same thing goes for education. Cities, for example, are facing a huge competition from what is now online education, for example, course creators. And in this regard, being credible is not enough anymore. You also need to prove that what you're doing works. So I'm not saying think tanks need to become YouTubers. That's not the shift that you want to, that's not what you want to be. But again, everyone is in the same condition to influence society. Everyone has potentially access to tools that are the same or even superior than what think tanks have been having so far. The attention cycle is getting shorter, and what smaller organizations are doing. Now, this doesn't mean becoming less rigorous. This doesn't mean becoming YouTubers, but it means showing up more often and adopting a wider range of formats to a communication that traditionally was just one way, the report. In this shift, you can think of ways in which actually the end product of your research is not just one, as it used to be, so the white paper, but it's actually multiple. So what was a monolithic essence before now gets broken into a multitude of different formats, all having the same backing of research, but then try to target different moments, different attention span, different audiences that consume the content in different ways. The second shift is AI. AI is a threat to a lot of professions that have something to do with communication, because obviously it makes everything much faster, easier, and it's also often questionable. AI makes everything faster, makes everything easier, and the access to what was done before in days is now just like a few seconds. Now, AI on one side is a threat to the creation of content, but there's good news for any company who is engaged with research, because AI so far can support research, but it cannot substitute it. AI cannot interview people. AI can analyze results, that can help you analyze results, but it cannot directly interview people, for example, or it cannot assist to something and report it. So from this point of view, there is still a very good gap for knowledge institutions to still be the accessible. So from this point of view, there is still a privileged position for every knowledge institution to be the forefront, the access to privileged information. But it's important to acknowledge what AI is doing to the communication layer, because it will create the chance for everybody to then craft position paper content about potentially some of the same issues in which think tanks are active. So the noise will increase. When noise increases, then the consequence is that for a lot of the institutions that are active in the same space, what will become more relevant is the company branding that these institutions can create. So, to phrase it in a different word, I will access content created by a specific institution, not just because of the content that it provides, but also because of the trust that I have in this institution. I trust that the sources are always scanned, are always checked. I trust that also the curation of the content that is sent to me is exactly what I want, is exactly what I need, is relevant for my job or for my view of the world. So the fact that AI increases the number of output that will be created means that the institution creating content and curating content will become more relevant. And that means that branding is going to play a central role in how these organizations are going to position themselves. The third force is about funding, which is shrinking, which is harder to justify the increased pressure that comes on governments and public funds. The third force is about the increased pressure that comes on funding. We have all assisted last year on the fact that, especially in the US, a lot of organizations have struggled because of the cuts of funds. Even governmental agencies like USAID have been disbanded overnight. There's a lot of uncertainty from public funds, which means that a lot of organizations, think tanks, knowledge organizations, nonprofit are looking at different sectors in order to diversify their risk. It's really an existential question. So from that point of view, especially private are more sensitive to what can you show, what can you demonstrate in terms of impact of what you create. So if an organization cannot demonstrate the impact of what they do, then access to funding becomes more tricky and it's potentially more risky to justify the existence of an organization. Now, the good news is that opening yourself to new channels and new ways of doing things will also allow you to explore ways in which it becomes way more direct to show the impact of what you're doing. New channels and new products as a result of research are also more in line with what a lot of private fundings have experience with. So a lot of companies funding research, funding nonprofits are way more in line with the way of thinking that comes from innovation and marketing rather than the funding cycles of the public. So these three forces are converging right now and are demanding for a big shift. The thing is that it opens for a window in which companies, institutions that want to experiment can do that. And as I said before, the experimentation itself will bring you closer to an audience which is different, which has changed, and also to the private, which has very different ways of thinking rather than the public sector. But there's a big barrier to it. And the barrier is actually not resources. The barrier is more a cultural barrier. So research is still what holds the main status inside of companies. Communication is seen often as an afterthought or something which is less relevant than research, just as an enabler, right? But not really as something which has a role in itself. Not to mention marketing, which is, a word that a lot of research organizations don't even want to consider. So the main shift is about changing the culture, the internal culture of these companies, opening yourself to new things, to experimentation, to innovation, which doesn't mean being salesy, doesn't mean being scrappy, but it means to conjugate innovation and opening yourself to something modern with everything that your institution has been doing so far. This requires a culture change, but it doesn't need a DNA change. So it's just a simple reframe where Knowledge organizations are not asked to change who they are. They are just asked to introduce new disciplines and open up their culture to something that will not change how they are, will just change the way in which they communicate to a public that has changed and that has different needs.